Hello, I'm Creation.
And I am the theory of evolution. Why are you so happy?
Oh, are you kidding? Because I have hope.
Hope.
You know, and the assurance that I have a purpose.
A purpose.
You can have one too, you know.
Don't want one.
What are you talking about? Everybody wants to have a purpose.
It's not true. Some people want to hold to the unproven fact that we're nothing more than a bunch of protoplasmic goo that evolved over billions of years and will end up as cosmic garbage, therefore serving no one or no purpose at all.
No hope or purpose?
Right.
That's so sad.
We are going to be talking about the origins of the universe, the origins of life, and the origins of humanity. Someone once wrote this: "My training makes it difficult, if not impossible, to accept the teachings of Christianity. As a believer in evolution, I cannot accept the Bible's pre-scientific accounts of the origins of life. Are science and faith compatible?" And one other person wrote this: "My road to atheism was paved by science, but ironically, so was my later journey to God." Lee Strobel wrote that. Well, tonight we have an astrophysicist who's going to come and talk to us for some time on the latest frontiers in scientific research. And he's going to make an argument that you can be scientifically intelligent and also be a person of Christian faith. Hugh Ross has earned a PhD in astronomy from the University of Toronto. He has written numerous books and has spoken on university campuses. He has debated atheists, and he has spoken around the world. Hugh lives with his wife, Kathy, in Southern California. And let's give Hugh a great, warm Edmonton welcome as he comes and does the presentation.
Well, thank you for inviting me here, and I just loved your band, and especially those three guys off to the right. They have just really cool hairstyles. And if you're here, I got a Bible verse for you three men. It's out of Leviticus 13, verse 42. If a man is bald, he is clean. So, well, the reason why I picked the topic tonight, origin of the universe, origin of life, and origin of humanity, it's been our experience at Reasons to believe that those are the three most significant pieces of evidences that bring intellectuals to faith in Christ. So what I want to do is review for you the very latest findings on those three frontiers. Reasons to Believe is an organization that focuses on brand new reasons to believe. And so we feature on our website something called Today's New Reason to Believe, where every day we give you an article written for the layperson about some recent scientific discovery that gives us more evidence for the Christian faith. You can get that as a free email sent to your computer or to your friend's computer, but get their permission first. And then the other thing we make available out of many things is something called Science Newsflash. When a scientific discovery is announced, we jump on it within 1 or 2 hours and give an audio explanation of how that provides more evidence for the Christian faith, and you can subscribe to that at either iTunes or on our website. Well, the topic tonight is the origin of the universe, life, and humanity. And an atheist physicist, Feng Li, in fact, he's probably China's most famous scientist, an astrophysicist, but also the one that led the Tiananmen Square protests. And he said this in his book. He said, "A question that has always been considered a topic of metaphysics or theology, the creation of the universe, has now become an area of active research in physics." And this was achieved by astronomers developing telescopes powerful enough to look far away and therefore far back in time. It takes light time to travel to our telescopes, and we can actually image the moment that the universe was created. As you'll see in a minute, this is where we come up with some profound evidence for the existence of the God of the Bible. Now, I want to start off by making the point that tonight's discussion is really not about intelligent design. As Paul Davies, an astronomer, said in his book, The Cosmic Blueprint, the impression of design is overwhelming. The intelligent design debate was won more than 20 years ago in the discipline of astronomy. In fact, an atheist physicist, Freeman Dyson, said, when you look at the universe, you can't avoid the conclusion that the universe in some sense knew that we were coming. It was designed in advance for human habitation. And so the real question is not whether or not there is design. All scientists concede that they see design, not just in astronomy, but all the scientific disciplines. The real debate is over who or what is responsible for that design. So 2 questions I want to address tonight. Is the scientific evidence for the creator God of the Bible, is that evidence shrinking or growing as we learn more about the record of nature? And is it such that today we can eliminate some or all of the alternate explanations? Now, the model we presented reasons to believe is a biblical model. I started studying astronomy. I grew up in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I started studying astronomy when I was 7 years of age. And the first book I read on cosmology at age 7 was one by Sir Fred Hoyle, a Hindu astronomer. Was from a Hindu perspective, but he had this to say in that book about the Bible. He said, there's a good deal of cosmology in the Bible. It is a remarkable conception. And it turns out he's right. The Bible contains 10 times as much content about the origin and structure of the universe as all the other holy books of the world's religions combined. And as you go through the Bible, you'll see that it makes 4 points over and over again about the origin and structure of the universe. First, it makes the point that the universe is traceable back to a singularity beginning. That's a physics term which means an actual beginning of matter, energy, space, and time. That the universe continuously expands from that point of beginning, that it expands under constant laws of physics, where one of those laws is a pervasive law of decay. And it was discovering this in the Bible which persuaded me at age 16 that there had to be a God. Now, many of you are probably familiar with at least the first one, the singularity beginning. In fact, no matter where I speak in the world, everybody seems to know the Bible's first sentence. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Heavens and earth refers to the entirety of matter, energy, space, and time. And the word there in the Hebrew for create means to bring into existence something brand new that didn't exist before. Hebrews 11:3, the universe that we detect did not come from that which we can detect. It came from beyond matter, energy, space, and time. There are Bible verses I haven't included here that actually speak about a specific beginning to space and time and God's actions before that beginning of time. Now, starting back in 1970, physicists began to develop theorems of mathematics which prove what the Bible had been stating for thousands of years. And these are referred to as the space-time theorems. And the first of these theorems, produced by Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose, made the following conclusion, that if the universe contains mass, and if general relativity reliably describes the dynamics of the universe, then space and time must have a beginning, and space and time must be created by a causal agent that transcends or operates outside of space and time. The significant point there is if you look at the other holy books of the religions of the world, they speak about God or gods or cosmic forces creating within space and time that eternally exists, where the Bible stands alone as saying that God creates independent, outside of space and time, that space and time did not exist until the universe was created. And that makes these the most theologically significant theorems that humans have ever produced. Now, we live in a day and an age where, of course, everybody recognizes the universe contains mass. Some of us are greater evidence for that than others. But it's also true that the theory of general relativity now ranks as the most exhaustively tested and best proven principle in all of physics. So on that basis, there's no reason to doubt that there is this beginning to space and time and a causal agent beyond space and time. But what happened over the course of a 10-year period, 2 physicists, Armin Bordet and Alexander Vilenkin, looked at these theorems and were disturbed by the theological implications and said, okay, what can we do to see if we can find some loophole, some way around this conclusion that forces us to accept this entity or being beyond space and time that creates the universe. And over the course of 10 years, they published 5 papers. And at the end of those 5 papers, they wound up concluding with an even more powerful theorem in this particular paper with a fascinating title, Inflationary Spacetimes Are Incomplete in Past Directions. That's how physicists talk. But what it really boils down to is this. Any universe that on average expands must have a beginning and a finite past and a causal agent beyond space and time that brings it into existence. And therefore they concluded that all reasonable expanding universe models are subject to the relentless grip of the space-time theorems. Now, what did they mean by reasonable? Because in their research, they did find ways where they didn't have to accept this causal agent. But these would involve universes in which life would be impossible. And so a reasonable universe is any universe that would permit the existence of physical life. And it's that kind of universe that demands a being beyond space and time that creates the universe. Now, what I've done here in just a few minutes, it gives you a rigorous scientific proof that the God of the Bible is responsible for bringing the universe into existence. But there's another point here too, namely that scientists no longer can presume that all causes are natural. Because what we've demonstrated here in a few minutes is scientific evidence for the greatest miracle that any scientist could ever hope to discover, namely the coming into existence of the totality of physical reality. And given that the Creator has intervened miraculously on that one occasion, that at least opens up the possibility that He may choose to intervene on other occasions besides just the moment of the creation of the universe. Now, as much as the Bible says about the beginning of the universe, it's got much more to say about the expansion of the universe. And these are a sampling of the passages of the Bible that speak about the stretching out of the heavens. But the Hebrew verb there is the verb natah, and it literally means a continuous expansion of whatever is being described. And it's in all three Hebrew verb forms. I debated Michael Shermer of the Skeptic Society on this point a couple of times, and he insisted that all these passages were metaphorical. But the fact that the verb natah shows up in the cal participle form, the cal perfect, and the cal imperfect form means that they must be taken literally, not figuratively or metaphorically. And evidence for that is Jewish theologians writing 1,000 years ago drew the conclusion that these passages demanded that the universe continuously expands from the beginning of space and time. Now, in my book, The Creator and the Cosmos, I lay out rigorous scientific proofs that we live in a continuously expanding universe. What I'm going to show you is not the most rigorous proof, but it is a visual one. Thanks to the Hubble Space Telescope, we have photo images of the past history of the universe. So on the left-hand side, we're looking 12 billion light years away, which means we're seeing the universe as it was 12 billion years ago, because that's how long it took the light to reach the Hubble Space Telescope. Whereas on the left-hand side, we see a shot 2 billion light years away, namely 2 billion years ago. And you can see, these are all to scale. So you can see how in the first image on the left, we have galaxies jammed so tightly together, they're literally ripping spiral arms off one another. We astronomers call these tadpole galaxies. But as the universe gets older and older, you can see how the galaxies have stretched apart. The universe has expanded, where no longer do we have all these galaxies ripping one another apart. Now, in addition to the universe continuously expanding, the Bible speaks about this expansion taking place under constant laws of physics. One verse is Jeremiah 33:25, where God speaks and He says, I've established the fixed laws of heavens and earth. And what we see in the Bible is teaching in Genesis and Revelation and Romans, as well as Jeremiah, to the effect that when God creates the universe, He keeps the laws of physics constant throughout the entire history of the universe until that future date when He permanently removes evil once and for all. And then we get a brand new creation with radically different laws of physics. But as long as this universe exists, the Bible claims the laws of physics remain fixed. And in Romans 8, it speaks about one of those laws, a law of decay, how the entire universe is subjected to this pervasive law of decay. Now, the engineers and scientists in the audience will know this is the second law of thermodynamics. The rest of you will refer to it as Murphy's Law, how everything tends to decay all by itself without us having to really do much to encourage that along. But notice that with these four statements, we get the specific prediction from the pages of the Bible that the universe must cool down. Most of you probably got here through an automobile. The principle of the automobile engine is when the piston chamber expands, the temperature goes down. When the piston chamber is compressed, the temperature goes up. That's that law of decay. And so with the universe operating under this law, under continuous expansion where the laws of physics don't change, that means the universe must get colder and colder in a very predictable way. And we were engaged in a debate at the University of California, Santa Barbara. An atheist physicist said there, I want to see some hard numbers that can put to a rigorous test the Bible's claims about the universe. Well, we showed him this. What you see here is the biblically predicted cooling curve for the universe. And overlapping it are 11 measurements that astronomers have made of the past temperature of the universe. But you can see how well those measurements of the temperature of the universe match what the Bible predicts by the degree to which it should cool down with respect to time. Now, two factors govern the expansion of the universe: gravity, which works to slow down the expansion, and dark energy, which works to speed it up. And dark energy wasn't discovered until 1999. We now know that it makes up 72% of all the stuff of the universe. What is dark energy? It's the energy embedded in the space fabric of the universe. And the universe is kind of like planet Earth. Planet Earth is 3 dimensions, but all of us human beings live on the 2-dimensional surface of the 3-dimensional Earth. Likewise, all the stars and galaxies and even all the space-time dimensionality is constrained to the surface, the 3-dimensional surface of the 4-dimensional universe. And dark energy determines whether or not you're going to get planets and stars that'll make life possible. If dark energy is too strong, the universe will expand so rapidly from the cosmic creation event that gravity will never be able to pull any gas together to make stars and planets. On the other hand, if dark energy is slightly weaker, the universe will expand at a sufficiently slow rate that gravity will now collide all the gas in the universe into black holes and neutron stars. Either way, life would be impossible. And astronomers now know that we have to fine-tune this dark energy parameter to better than 1 part in 10 to the 122nd power, or there's no possibility for physical life anytime, anywhere in the universe. Now that's 122 zeros after the 1. To give you some point of comparison, what I want to do is compare the level of fine-tuning design in dark energy with the very best example we can pull out of human engineering design achievement. And in my opinion, that would be the gravity wave telescope that's operating in the state of Washington, Louisiana, and now they've got a 3rd arm in Pisa, Italy. But this amazing machine ranks 10 to the 97 times inferior to the level of design we see just in this dark energy term. Now, a lot of my colleagues will say the physics and the astronomy simply proves that there's an entity beyond space and time that created the universe. They would deny that it's a personal being. But what this evidence shows us is that the one that designed dark energy, at a minimum, is 10 to the 97 times more knowledgeable and better educated than the Caltech and MIT physicists that designed this gravity wave telescope, and at least that many times better funded than the US taxpayers that made it all possible. Now, I think you can get my point here. This is not simply an entity that transcends space and time and that creates the universe of matter, energy, space, and time. This is an entity who is knowledgeable, who is intelligent, who is powerful, who is creative, and caring with respect to preparing the universe exquisitely for his creatures. And these are only attributes that a personal being could possess. So it's not just a transcendent entity, we're talking a personal being. and we're talking a personal being that's orders and orders of magnitude more intelligent, more knowledgeable, creative, and caring and powerful than the gods of the competing religions of Christianity. Now, this is a point that has not simply been picked up by Christian astronomers and physicists like myself. It's been noted by atheist physicists. And I have here a paper written by 3 atheist physicists with the title Disturbing Implications of a Cosmological Constant, which is another way of referring to dark energy. And let me just pull out some quotes from the 3 authors. One quote is that arranging the universe as we think it is arranged, that is with dark energy, would have required a miracle. And here's another quote. An external agent, namely external to space and time, intervened in cosmic history for reasons of its own. Hence the title of the paper, Disturbing Implications. They found this conclusion based on dark energy so utterly disturbing, the idea that there was this agent beyond space and time performing miracles for reasons of his own, that they concluded this paper with this sentence. This is the last sentence in the paper. The only reasonable conclusion is we do not live in a world that is a universe with a true cosmological constant. In other words, they said the implications are philosophically so disturbing, dark energy must be wrong. And so they're predicting that physicists would discover that dark energy was simply a myth. Now, the irony of this paper is that it was posted as a preprint on the Los Alamos website for research papers in theoretical physics. In some cases, weeks, in other cases, just a few months before astronomers developed 9 independent observational demonstrations, not only that dark energy is real, but it's the dominant component of the universe, making up 72% of all the stuff. I won't go into the technical details. You can go to our reasons.org website. We have an article on all 9 of these measurements of dark energy with citations to the literature, so you can check that out. But dark energy is not the only factor in which we astronomers see this evidence for the supernatural design of the cosmos for the benefit of life and human beings in particular. We see this in every constant of physics that we can measure. All 4 forces of physics must be exquisitely fine-tuned in order to make our existence possible. For example, if you were to change the ratio of the electromagnetic force relative to the gravitational force by as little as 1 part in 10,000 trillion, there'd be no possibility for physical life anytime, anywhere in the universe. And likewise, we have to fine-tune the ratio of the proton to electron number and the mass, velocity of light, expansion rate. There's many more. And we started doing this kind of research back in 1991. That's when I published the 2nd edition of The Fingerprint of God. And at that time, going through the scientific literature, we found 17 different features of the laws of physics and the features of the universe that must be fine-tuned to an exquisite degree to make life possible. But what we've been doing since then is measuring the rate at which that evidence has been advancing. Because once again, if our model is correct, we should expect the evidence to increase rather than decrease. And this is what we've observed between 1991 and the end of 2006. And so the list has grown from 17 features to 140 different features, and we're working on an update right now, which will be a little less than 200 different features that must be fine-tuned. Now, what we're seeing here is evidence for design on the largest scales. And that's where a lot of my astronomer friends stop. You know, Paul Davies and others make the point that it's the universe that has been designed. But if actually we get a little bit closer to home, we see design on all size scales. In other words, it's not just requiring an exquisitely fine-tuned universe, we need a just right galaxy. We live in a spiral galaxy with incredibly symmetrical spiral arms. We don't see any other galaxy like ours. And it takes a just right star to make physical life possible, a just right Jupiter, In fact, we need a just right Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Venus, all the way down the line. Now that we got Pluto appropriately demoted, we recognize that all 8 planets play a crucial role in making advanced life possible here on planet Earth. And of course, we need a just right Earth, and we need a just right Moon. Now, getting a little bit closer to home here allows us to develop a number of powerful tests of competing creation evolution models. And this is taken straight from the words of the Apostle Paul. He said, when it comes to issues of faith, everything must be tested. There is no room in Christianity for blind faith. Everything is to be put to an objective test. And you weed out that which fails the test, and you hang on to that which proves to be good and true. Let me give you a couple of examples of how this works. In my book, More Than a Theory, I compare 6 competing creation evolution models. To save time, let me just focus on 2. The model we've developed at Reasons to Believe, the biblical creation model, compared with the atheistic naturalistic model. Now, if there's no creator responsible for what we see in nature, we would expect as we learn more about the record of nature that these evidences for supernatural design would decrease both in strength and in number. On the other hand, and also that the evidence for the biblical God as a designer would get progressively weaker. But if our model is correct, the biblical creation model, we would anticipate the exact opposite. That as we learn more, that the evidence would increase, both in the number of parameters needing design and the degree of design we're seeing there, and the evidence for the biblical God as designer would get progressively stronger. Well, with respect to our Milky Way galaxy and our solar system, we first started doing this research in 1995. And at that time, we noted 41 different features of our galaxy and solar system that needed to be fine-tuned to make physical life possible, and appropriately accounting for the dependency factors. And I assumed Carl Sagan's estimate for the number of planets in the universe. I happened to have him briefly as a professor when I was at the University of Toronto, and he claimed that there was at least 10 billion trillion planets in the universe. So taking his optimistic number, that still left us with a probability of less than 1 chance in 10 to the 31 that all 41 features would be met without invoking the God of the Bible. But let me show you how the evidence has increased since 1995. Instead of 41 features, we can now document 676 different characteristics that must be fine-tuned, and now the probability is less than 1 chance in 10 to the 556th power. Now, to put that in some context, realize there's only 10 to the 79 protons and neutrons in the entire observable universe. So it's a probability far more remote than the chance that blindfolded you could pick out a single marked proton from all the protons that exist in the universe. Now, what I want you to note too is how rapidly this evidence is accumulating. Over these past 20 years, we've been observing the evidence getting approximately 1 million times stronger in favor of the God of the Bible every single month. Which means we can say to the skeptic, if you're not convinced today, wait 30 days. And let's just see what gets published in the scientific literature. And that's why we make available or feature today's new reason to believe. Because literally every day, there's 10 or 20 research papers being published that give us more evidence for the Christian faith. Literally a factor of 1 million per month more evidence. Here's another test. If there's no creator, we would expect that these design evidences would be for life in general and not humans in particular. But as you go through the creation accounts in the Bible, and we got them all posted on our website, what you discover is the Bible claims much more exquisite design for human beings than the rest of life, because God's goal was that all this life would be here to support human beings. We are the center of attention in terms of God's creation of his universe. Therefore, we'd expect that these design evidences would be far more pronounced for human beings than for life in general. Now, what I'm going to give you the next slide is just a little a snippet. On our website, we take this into much more detail. We actually compare 6 different kinds of life. Here are just 3. What kind of design do you need if all you're looking for is a planet or a moon that can support bacterial life for 3 months or less? See, the advantage there is you don't have to recycle nutrients. If it's only 90 days, just let the bacteria consume the nutrients. But if you want bacteria to hang around for 3 billion years or more, now you need efficient and well-sustained continual nutrient recycling mechanisms, and consequently the probability is far more remote. And then the bottom one is human beings, less than 1 chance in 10 to the 1,050th power that you'd expect to find any body in the universe with a capacity to support life. And when I debated Victor Stenger, the particle physicist at Caltech, in front of the Skeptic Society, that's one point where we agreed. We agreed that the entire universe was hostile to life except for this pale blue dot that we call planet Earth. Mind you, he was claiming that that proved there was no God, because if God really loved us, he wouldn't confine us to such a tiny habitat space. My rebuttal to that is it's kind of like having a child that's only 1 or 2 years old. You have a playpen because you need something to keep that child safe, and that from God's perspective, the human species right now is simply too immature to be granted a larger habitat space than planet Earth. But the good news is, Revelation 21, in the new creation, when evil no longer exists, God will give us a habitat space bigger than what any of us can imagine, bigger than this universe that we can see. Well, let me give you another one. If there's no creator, astronomers will find many systems capable of permitting advanced life, like the Milky Way galaxy, the sun, the moon, Earth, and Earth's planetary partners. And when I took that course from Carl Sagan, he was preaching that message in every lecture, that as we go look out in the universe, we're going to find millions and billions of galaxies and planets and stars that are just like the galaxy, planet, and star that we enjoy, and therefore intelligent life would be everywhere within the universe. But if you look at what the Bible claims, the human species again is center stage. And so we would anticipate that the Milky Way galaxy, sun, moon, Earth, and Earth's planetary partners would all prove to be unique in their capacity to permit advanced life. And so the question is, does our model of reasons to believe fit reality, or does the model of the search for extraterrestrial intelligent life out there in Santa Cruz, California, and Carl Sagan, is that really the way to go? Well, this is a risky prediction on both sides, because we're just now beginning to measure galaxies, stars, and planets with sufficient precision to determine whether or not they're hostile to life, or indeed that they're everywhere we look within our universe. Well, let me give you the evidence that we see so far. In terms of our Milky Way galaxy, we do see billions and billions of galaxies, but there's only a few thousand that we can measure with sufficient precision to determine whether or not they're a close enough twin of our Milky Way galaxy in order to support advanced life. And of all the ones we've examined so far with that degree of detail, none have the characteristics that our Milky Way manifests that would make possible the existence of advanced life. Now, where this research has been most fertile is with stars, because stars are bright, they're easy to measure with a considerable degree of precision. In fact, there's a group of 3 astronomers that have spent 50 years searching our galaxy for a twin of our sun. And what they have found are many stars that are twins of one another, but they've yet to find a star that's a twin of our sun. The sun's characteristics remain unique in enabling the possibility of a planet orbiting that star in which advanced life would be possible. And as of day before yesterday, astronomers had discovered 443 planets outside of our solar system. And when the first planets were discovered outside of our solar system 15 years ago, astronomers were predicting we're going to find oodles and oodles of planets that are just like Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. Well, so far we have found 0. None of them are like the gas giant planets in our solar system. And as a result, we now realize that the features of each of those gas giant planets are critical to make advanced life safe here on planet Earth. Now, moons, we can only observe moons in our solar system. 169 have been found, but our moon sticks out like a sore thumb. In terms of how massive our moon is relative to its planet, our moon is 50 times more massive than any other moon in our solar system. And that's the kind of moon you need to stabilize the tilt of the rotation axis so that advanced life would be possible on our planet Earth. Now, I've given this kind of talk in front of physicists and astronomers who are not believers. And the response I get, and I got this too when I did the debate at Caltech, was that this is just simply the God of the gaps, that you're trying to fit God into these gaps of knowledge. And I says, well, are we really talking about the God of the gaps? And really, what the atheists are trying to put on me is, we're not going to believe in your God of the Bible until you can close all the gaps. Well, that would require the Christian to have total knowledge of everything there is to know about the universe. And of course, that'll never happen. I don't have total knowledge of my wife, let alone all these stars and galaxies. But the truth of the matter is, gaps exist on both sides of the debate. There are gaps in the naturalistic model, and of course, there are gaps in our model. But these gaps are wonderful tools that allow us to test different competing models. And in terms of the nature of the gaps, it's fair for the scientists to ask the question, do the naturalistic explanatory gaps get bigger or smaller, more or less numerous, more or less problematic as scientists learn more about the record of nature? Well, what you have been hearing me say these past few minutes is in terms of the origin of the universe and the design of the universe, the naturalistic explanatory gaps are getting dramatically bigger and dramatically more numerous. And this is also true for the origin of life and the origin of humanity. Now let me spend a few minutes talking about the origin of life. We have a book that's totally focused on that topic. It's called Origins of Life by our staff biochemist, Fuz Rana, and myself. And we're talking about here the origin of physical life. I'm actually bringing out a book next year on the origin of soulish life. But what I'm talking about here is the origin of the simplest life forms. Now, this is brought up in the Bible, first in Genesis 1:2, where it says, the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters of planet Earth, and the world was formless and void. Now, this phrase rahop in the Hebrew about hovering is used one other time in the Bible, in the book of Deuteronomy, where it speaks about a female eagle brooding or hovering over her eggs just after those eggs have hatched. And therefore, we believe that Genesis 1:2 is a reference to God creating the first life. And on this basis, we can develop a number of biblical predictions about what we'd expect scientists to discover about the origin of life. Genesis 1:2, that means it's very early in the history of the earth. It's under hostile conditions. The world was formless and void, empty and wasted. That the first life would be complex, diverse, and abundant. It wouldn't be just a single life form. Why? Because God is aggressive, according to the Bible, and wanting to prepare the earth as quickly as possible for human beings and human civilization. That introduction of life would be miraculous and instantaneous, and it would be marine life only, because it takes place at a point when water covers the whole face of the earth. Now, as I mentioned, I took a course from Carl Sagan, and in that course he talked about his model for the origin of life, namely that it would take place late rather than early, after enormous time, under benign conditions, in a huge concentrated soup. His model was that the entire oceans of the earth were a rich soup of prebiotic molecules, and they percolated for 1 billion years, and by random chance out popped these simple life forms. And this simple life form would be very simple at first, much simpler than the simplest life we have today, and it would be a single species only. And if you pick up your standard textbook on biological evolution, it refers to LUCA, the last universal common ancestor, the evolutionary concept that all life is descended from a single bacterium. But the Bible has a very different model. Okay, what does the scientific evidence tell us? In terms of the origin of life, we're faced with a number of paradoxes. And Fuzz and I saw this laid out as we attended Origin of Life research conferences. The recognition that the origin of life took place in an instantaneous period of time, geologically speaking. How do we know this? Well, we know this because of the late heavy bombardment. When you look at the craters on the moon and Mercury, you can see that those craters are slightly weathered. And the weathering tells us that those craters were formed predominantly 3.85 billion years ago. And likewise, we can do research on the orbit of Jupiter and Saturn and recognize they destabilize the Kuiper belt of comets and asteroids 3.85 billion years ago, pelting the Earth with over 17,000 giant impactors bigger than the one that wiped out the dinosaurs at 65 million years ago. And it turned the surface of the Earth into a molten state. Obviously, life can't exist under those conditions. And over the course of 50 million years, the Earth cools to a point where liquid water is possible. But the problem for people like Carl Sagan is we have the chemical signature through nitrogen, sulfur, and carbon isotopes that tell us that life was abundant on planet Earth as far back as 3.8 billion years ago. Well, you can all do the math. Take 3.85, subtract 50 million years. What do you get? You get 3.80 billion years. So it means the origin of life took place in a whisper of time. There isn't a billion years. It measures zero to the degree of our measuring capability. So the origin of life takes place without any measurable time. Moreover, we now know there's no soup, because those same isotope signatures, carbon-12 to carbon-13 especially, tell us whether or not the carbonaceous molecules are prebiotic or postbiotic. And all of these molecules we see in the crust of the Earth are postbiotic. We don't see prebiotic chemicals in the past history of the Earth. And it was a physicist in Romania who explained why. It's the oxygen ultraviolet paradox. How you have oxygen in the early Earth's environment, that oxygen is toxic to prebiotic chemistry. The famous Urey-Miller experiment where they made amino acids in a flask, put the tiniest amount of oxygen in there, nothing happens. But if you don't have oxygen, ultraviolet radiation from the sun streams into the surface of the Earth, and ultraviolet radiation, just like oxygen, is toxic to prebiotic chemistry. So you see the paradigm here, the paradox here. If you got oxygen, you can't get prebiotic chemistry. If you don't have oxygen, you can't get prebiotic chemistry. And there's a Romanian physicist who showed that the answer is you got oxygen. You also have ultraviolet radiation. But either way, you don't get a prebiotic soup. Well, there's no soup and there's no time, then there's no naturalistic pathway for the origin of life. And that's also pointed out by the fact that there's no solution to the homochirality problem. What's the homochirality problem? The fact that all of the amino acids in your proteins are left-handed and all the sugars in your DNA and RNA are right-handed. And if you mix up the left and the right, then you can't get these molecules to assemble. They all must be left or they all must be right. But the problem is nowhere on the Earth and nowhere in the universe is there a physical mechanism to take the mix of left and right-handedness and sift it out so all you got is the left or the right. The closest you come is ultraviolet circularly polarized light that's emanating from black holes and neutron stars. But even then, the best you can get is about a 60% favoritism towards right or left, not the 100% that life demands. And I personally can't think of a worse place for prebiotic chemistry than the neighborhood of a black hole or a neutron star. It's just not going to happen. And as we attended the Origin of Life Research Conference, that's what launched astrobiology. The recognition that there's no way you can explain the origin of life on planet Earth from a naturalistic perspective, so they said it must come from Mars. Life originated on Mars, and meteors transferred that life from Mars to Earth. But the problem there is you got the same late heavy bombardment. There's no time for the origin of life on Mars. You've got a carbonate crisis, which means if it's ever warm and wet in Mars, the carbon molecules will be quickly converted permanently into carbonates because there isn't the plate tectonics to reverse it like there is on planet Earth. You've got the same oxygen ultraviolet crisis, and there's no solution to homochirality, which is what caused the Origin of Life community to abandon Mars. And then they said, well, let's look at interstellar clouds. good place to look because we see 125 carbonaceous molecules when we look at the spectra of these interstellar clouds. But as you look at those spectra, there's no ammonia. If there's no ammonia, you can't make RNA and DNA. We see no sugars. And without sugars, you can't assemble the nucleotides to make RNA and DNA. And there's no nucleobases, so you can't even get the raw materials to get the nucleotides to come together. Likewise, there's no amino acids, and there's no homochirality source. So life can't come from an interstellar cloud. Well, they began to speculate that maybe some kind of dust began to penetrate the Earth, and somehow there was a bacterium embedded in that dust. But the problem is that dust has got to travel under X-ray and ultraviolet radiation exposure, which would destroy any life and destroy the proteins, RNA and DNA. The transport times are in the millions of years, and these things decay in thousands of years, in some cases only hours. And then when it goes through the atmosphere, it's going to be heated to 500 degrees centigrade. So this is not a good option for bringing life to planet Earth. And finally, at this Origin of Life conference, they said, well, it's got to be a rock. If we get a rock that's 2 meters in diameter, there's a possibility that a bacterium in the dead center, where there's no cracks or porosity to the rock, could be protected from the ultraviolet and X-ray radiation. And therefore, they began to speculate maybe an interstellar rock brought life from some distant planetary system. But an astronomer by the name of J. Malosh calculated how frequently planet Earth would get a rock the size of my fist or bigger. And the answer is we only get one every 10 to the 16 years on the average. Well, that's 1 million times more time than the entire age of the universe. The universe is 1 million times too young to get even one rock coming to us from another planetary system. Finally, at the end of the second Origin of Life research conference we attended, a scientist went up to the microphone and said, we've eliminated everything to explain the origin of life except directed panspermia. What's directed panspermia? Spaceships brought life here to planet Earth. But the problem with this directed panspermia is, what about the origin of the aliens? They face the same problem about the origin of life. Moreover, as I've explained in a book of mine, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, the laws of physics will not permit a spacecraft to travel with life born on it without that life being killed. If you read that book, it'll spoil your enjoyment for Star Trek. Okay, what's left? Well, the Santa Fe Institute, an institute of scientists trying to promote an atheistic worldview, have been writing articles to the effect that Darwinian evolution can't explain the origin of life or the history of life, but what they're insisting is it's a hidden law of physics. Some hidden law in the universe is self-organizing things in a way that we can't see. The problem with that speculation, however, in order to make life possible in the universe must be extraordinarily homogeneous and uniform. So homogeneous and uniform, it leaves no room for such a hidden law of physics. And when the president of the Santa Fe Institute spoke at Caltech, he admitted that he had zero observational evidence for this hidden law. But in astronomy, if such a law existed, we would see it, we don't see it. So what are we really left with? Well, how about Genesis 1:2? The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. I mean, what's really happened over the past 20 years is Origin of Life researchers have eliminated every possible naturalistic explanation except the one that the Bible speaks about, where God supernaturally intervenes. If you want to read more about this, you can pick up our book, Origins of Life. It did receive an endorsement from one of the world's leading atheist Origin of Life researchers. What he said about the book is, I don't care about the Jesus Christ part, but I do agree that all the science in the book is accurate and actually is more extensive in trying to explain things than the current textbooks that are out there. Well, let's jump ahead from the simplest life to the most complex life, the origin of human beings. And the story is, did humans evolve from a knuckle-walking primate or from something even more primitive than that knuckle-walking primate? But let me begin with something really basic, and this comes from the gentleman who won the Templeton Prize just a few days ago. That's a prize given out for people who try to integrate science and faith issues. And Francisco Ayala, a geneticist at the University of California, Irvine, years ago, tackled the problem of trying to go from bacteria to human beings. He says, we all know that the first life was bacterial, and we all know that human beings are the end of the line for the history of life here on planet Earth. And what he did is he presumed that Darwinian evolution works at the most optimistic rate that any evolutionist could possibly imagine. So very efficient gene exchange, mutations, natural selection, where everything is positive and nothing is negative, pulling it down. He assumed there was no entropy anywhere in the biological evolution. But even with those most optimistic assumptions, he determined that the probability that if you begin with bacteria or the equivalent and wind up with human beings in a time span of less than 5 billion years, he said that probability he calculated was less than 1 chance in 10 to the 1 millionth power. So that's 0.000, where you got 999,999 zeros between the decimal point and the 1. And on that basis, Francisco Ayala concluded there cannot be extraterrestrial intelligent life. With a probability this remote, it's impossible that there would be intelligent life elsewhere in the universe. Now, it was 3 physicists who came on top of Francisco Ayala and said, no, wait a minute. You presume that the solar system provides us with a constant ideal environment for the evolution of life. We physicists know that's not true. And indeed, that's accurate. The sun today is 15% brighter than it was 3 billion years ago. The Earth is rotating 6 times more slowly. The radiation on the Earth is only 1/5 of what it was when life first existed here on planet Earth. And when you take the changing environment into context, the probability under optimistic Darwinian assumptions is less than 1 chance in 10 to the 24 millionth power. Now, I don't know whether you got a lottery in Alberta or not. We have a lottery in California, and California's got more citizens than the entire nation of Canada. And they have this lottery running, and the probability of winning the top prize is not very good. But to give you some idea what this probability means, it's equivalent to the probability of someone winning the California lottery 3 million consecutive times, where each time they buy just 1 ticket. Or as a mathematician friend of mine put it, it's no different from the probability of winning the California lottery 3 million consecutive times where you buy no tickets at all. Now, these calculations were developed to prove that extraterrestrial intelligent life is impossible. But I want you to note, those probabilities also apply to us. Under naturalistic assumptions, the human race is impossible, but we are clearly here, which means we must have gotten here by supernatural means, since by natural means the probabilities prove that we are impossible. Well, let me give you a quick lesson on the bipedal primates that preceded human beings. First question is, who is Homo sapiens? They're not human. Homo sapiens are not human beings. They're basically a tropical Neanderthal type of bipedal primate. They lived about 80,000 to 170,000 years ago, and they were nothing like us human beings. But they take the title Homo sapiens. The technical term for the human race is Homo sapiens sapiens, because under Homo sapiens are included Neanderthals, Homo sapiens idaltu, the tropical types, as well as human beings. We are Homo sapiens sapiens. Well, what about these Neanderthals? Well, we now have mitochondrial DNA. This slide's a bit out of date. We have them from 20 different specimens as of last week. And as we look at those 20 different specimens from which we recovered mitochondrial DNA, we see no measurable change in the DNA. Neanderthals were here for 100,000 years. During that 100,000 year period, we can't measure any change in the DNA. Neither do we see any change over the geographical range. And as we look at their DNA and compare it to human DNA, it's radically distinct. It's nothing like our DNA. And this is what's caused the scientific community to abandon the hypothesis that Neanderthals and humans are related. The DNA is too different. And likewise, we see now that the bone structure is different. They are more barrel-shaped than we are, shorter limbs than we have, and they have a huge nasal capacity, all designed to enable them to live in a cold climate. Well, the theory now is that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens sapiens are evolving from a common ancestor that we call Homo erectus. Homo erectus lived 200,000 to 1.8 million years ago. We don't have any DNA because the DNA that's that old would be too corrupted. It would not be reliable. However, we see a very distinct morphology. Their morphology, they're slender, about 5 feet tall, with a cranial brain capacity that's only half of what you see in Neanderthals and human beings. And notice they were around for 1.6 million years. But as we compare the skeletons over those 1.6 million years, we see no evolution. Now, this is supported by recent research that shows that if a species is a land mammal that weighs more than 7 kilograms, more than 3 kilograms, it will go extinct before it experiences any measurable evolution. And indeed, that's what we're seeing. In the human species, we got DNA that goes back 40,000 years, and we see no change in the DNA. We see no change in the DNA of Neanderthals, and we see no change in the skeletal structures of Homo erectus, showing that all these bipedal primates indeed were created, but they did not evolve. Now, mitochondrial DNA is what we get from our mothers. All of us here have mitochondrial DNA, but you only get it from your mother, which means the only way my mitochondrial DNA could be different from my mother's is if I experience a natural mutation. And so what scientists do is they compare the present human population's mitochondrial DNA, and that comparison allows them to put to the test, are we descended from many women or a single woman? And the answer is, we owe our descent to a single female. And we can actually determine where that single female lived, somewhere within 1,500 miles of the juncture of Africa, Asia, and Europe, and lived about 150,000 years ago. That's what you'll see on PBS and Discovery. However, 10% of us have 2 sets of mitochondrial DNA, and 1% of us have 3 sets. When you take into account heteroplasmy and triplasmy, it reduces the date to 50,000 years ago for that first woman. Now, we see no evolution in the mitochondrial DNA of humans. On the male side, we got the Y chromosome. Women don't have this, only men. But again, the only way my Y chromosome can be different from my father's is if I experience a natural mutation. So once again, scientists sample Y chromosomes over the present human population. And like with mitochondrial DNA, they dig up people that have been dead for 5,000 years, 10,000, 20,000 years, and check out their Y chromosome DNA. That tells you how rapidly it changes naturalistically. And it shows us that we're descended from a single man who lived near the juncture of Africa, Asia, and Europe. It is comforting that the first man lived at the same location as the first woman. And the date we get is comparable, 42,000 to 56,000 years ago. And again, we see no evolution in the Y chromosome. Now, this is such compelling evidence that the reigning paradigm in human origins now takes the name the Garden of Eden hypothesis. And the scientific literature, they refer to the first human as the mitochondrial DNA Eve and the Y chromosome Adam. You'll see that throughout the scientific literature. But they're not yet calling it a theory. They're calling it the Garden of Eden hypothesis because there's a nagging problem called the younger Adam paradox. Where we get our best data is when we sample populations where there's no foreigners coming in or people leaving. And now we're reduced to only 5 stable populations in the world. We have the Estonians, the Finns, the Armenians, the Jews, and the Japanese. And we examine those 5 populations, we discover that you consistently get a much earlier date for the first woman than the first man by thousands of years. Now that's embarrassing to have the first woman living thousands of years before the first man. That hence the title, the younger Adam paradox. How can the first woman live thousands of years before the first man? Now, this resolution, here, I got 2 slides here, let me get through this. This resolution has a solution in the story of Noah. Because what does the Bible say about Noah? The entire human species is descended from 8 people on board Noah's Ark, 4 men and 4 women. But there's a huge genetic difference between the men and the women. It's Noah and his 3 sons, which means they all have the same Y chromosome. The 3 sons got it from their dad. But the 4 women are unrelated. They're the wives of the 4 men, which means that from mitochondrial DNA, you could be going back all the way to Eve herself, but when you go through the Y chromosome, it's going to bottleneck at that one man, Noah, because the technique simply gets you back to the most recent single ancestor to the human species. So the Y DNA stops at Noah, and we would resolve the paradox by saying it's not the Y chromosome Adam, it's the Y chromosome Noah. And if you look at the Bible, it's clear that we got Noah living thousands of years after Eve. Now, let me just sum up by this. What you see in the Bible is 7 days of creation. But God creates for the first 6 days, and he rests on the 7th day. First time I picked up a Bible was when I was 17. And going through Genesis 1, I saw these 6 creation days bracketed by an evening and a morning. But when I got to day 7, there's no evening and morning. And in John chapter 5, it tells us that's the day when God the Father and God the Son and God the Holy Spirit rests from their work of creation. Now this really explains why we have this scientific debate. I'm an astronomer, but there's only about 5,000 of us in the entire world. You know how many biologists there are? Over 3 million research biologists. And the vast majority of those biologists are doing research in the present era. And if you're a scientist and all you're doing is experiments and observations in the present era, that's when God's at rest. That explains why so many scientists say, we don't see any evidence for God's handiwork. But it also explains why so many physicists and astronomers and mathematicians are believers, because they're looking in the past. And as they're sampling data from the past, they're sampling in the 6 creation days. And so you hear them saying, we see evidence for God everywhere, whereas a biologist says, we don't see that evidence. Well, Genesis 1 explains it. For 6 days God created. On the 7th day he rested. He ceased from his work of creation. And referring to Genesis chapter 1, once we appreciate that indeed this word yom refers to a long period of time, and the frame of reference is the surface of the earth, this is the score you get for the creation account. It gets a perfect score of 4 for 4 on the initial conditions and 10 for 10 on the events of creation. And it was that discovery that caused me to sign my name in the back of a Gideon Bible at age 19 at the University of British Columbia. 8 years later, when I arrived on the Caltech campus, I met Christians. You know, Canada is different from the US. What I notice about Canada is Christians tend to congregate amongst themselves rather than mix throughout the population. When I came to the US, I couldn't help but bump into Christians. But all the time I was being raised in downtown Vancouver and downtown Calgary and Montreal and Toronto, I never met Christians. I know where to find them now. You go out into the suburbs, you'll find them. But I couldn't find them where I was living. But thanks to the Gideons, I gave my life to Christ at age 19, and it was through this discovery, realizing that the Bible alone had this perfection. Well, if you want to read a little bit more about this, a good book to start with is this one, Why the Universe is the Way It Is, written at a very lay level, easy to read, but gives you the big picture on creation. Really lays out what's different about the first creation, this universe, compared to the new creation. But if you want to get into the details of what I discussed tonight, we have a book called More Than a Theory, where we compare our testable biblical creation model with competing models of creation evolution. And if you don't want to read 300 pages, we have a 24-page summary called What Darwin Didn't Know. So with that, I'd like to transition to questions and discussion. I'll take any question you've got on faith, science, the Bible, other philosophies, other religions. The only rule I'm going to bring here is if you've got 3 questions or more, please ask them one at a time. 1 question per person per turn. My memory isn't as good as it used to be, and also I want to make sure everybody has a chance to ask at least 1 question. So we've got gentlemen with microphones here, and if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand, and they'll come around with a microphone to have you make your question or comment. Over here, okay?
How does a scientist, a physicist, know where Adam and Eve lived? How does it narrow it down to the juncture of Europe, Asia, and Africa?
Okay, how the DNA sampling works is they go all over the world and they check out these stable kiths. That's where you get your best evidence. And they look at the variation in different parts of the world. And their presumption is where the variation is greater, that will be a little closer to where humanity must have started. I didn't tell you the whole story. The DNA evidence also documents that humanity resided in one locale and then quickly migrated and then stopped migrating. So it's a non-random migration. There was an early period just before the Neolithic era where you got this very rapid migration. That's how North America and South America got populated. People came over the Bering Land Bridge towards the end of the last ice age, and in less than 1,000 years made it all the way down to the bottom tip of South America. But what was happening is that people were migrating quickly and then stopping and setting up their stakes there. So the DNA evidence actually demonstrates that that took place, and we can measure the roots of the migration and the rate at which the migration took place. But if you trace it all back, it gets you somewhere near the juncture of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Some of the geneticists will say it's Ethiopia. However, they're not taking into account the large error bars on these measurements. And if you really look at the data honestly, it's giving you the location to plus or minus 1,500 miles. So that's why I say the juncture of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Okay, we got a few hands up here. If we can get a microphone.
Hi, in the topic of dark matter, I was watching it was a repeat of a NOVA program, I think that was done in 2005, and they were discussing that dark matter was new, and they had speculated that it was up to 95% of space, and you're saying now it's closer to 72. What have they learned, or what do we know now that has changed that figure?
Well, when they said 95%, it was 95% plus or minus 30%. Okay? We now got it pinned down to 72 or 73% plus or minus about 3%. So we have much more accurate measurements now, and what's beautiful is that these 9 techniques I was telling you about, they're all giving the same answer for the quantity of dark energy, namely that it's in the low 70s%. So, yeah, back in 2005, the error bars were bigger, but they're much smaller now. Okay, we got hands here. Okay, I'm over here.
I'm a loud kind of guy, but there's some creationists that want to put the origin of the Earth and the whole universe 6,000 years back, because they're taking sort of a technical approach to the number of years that people lived on Earth, and they get really hung up on the 6,000 or give or take place, and they're actually, sending messages out there on DVDs. I'm concerned about that message.
Okay, that is one of the models that we take on in the book more than a theory. We not only compare models outside of Christianity, the evolutionary models and the Hindu models, we also look at models within the body of Christ. And the 3 that we looked at in some detail, in addition to our model, would be the framework hypothesis, theistic evolution, and the young earth creationist model, which is the model you're referring to. And how they developed that model is they look at Genesis chapter 1, where it talks about these creation days, and they presume that the days are 24 hours. Now, both sides agree that when you look at the word yom in Hebrew that's translated day, that it has 4 different literal definitions. part of the daylight hours, all of the daylight hours, a 24-hour period, or a long but finite period of time. There's also agreement on both sides that the only word you have in biblical Hebrew for a long finite period of time is the word yom. And that really explains why this controversy seems so focused on English language speaking peoples. Biblical Hebrew is one of the tiniest vocabulary languages that humanity has ever produced. There's only 3,000 words total if you don't count proper nouns. Whereas in English, we have 4 million words. And so in English, we have over a dozen different words for a long, finite period of time. Age, era, epoch, eon would be just a few of them. But in biblical Hebrew, the only word you got is that word yom that's translated day. And so the real challenge is, let's look at all the creation accounts in the Bible and see which one of those literal definitions allows you to read the entire Bible literally and consistently. The other thing young earth creationists do is they presume that there are very few gaps in the genealogies recorded in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. Now, all scholars agree that there are gaps, but young earth creationists would argue for gaps that you could number on one hand, whereas most Hebrew scholars would argue that there's probably an order of magnitude more gaps than just what you can count on one hand. Theistic evolutionists would argue that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of gaps. The position we take is what you see predominant in conservative seminaries, that we're probably looking at dozens to something under 100 gaps rather than 5 or millions of gaps. In fact, what we've done at Reasons to Believe is to calibrate the Genesis genealogies. You can actually do that because we have a good historical date for Abraham, which is the last man mentioned in Genesis 11. That's the genealogy that goes from Noah down to Abraham. And then halfway down the genealogy, we have Peleg. And in Genesis 10, it tells us the world was divided in the days of Peleg. And we believe that's a reference to the breaking of the Bering Land Bridge, which now has an accurate date. That's been dated as 11,000 years ago. So if Peleg lived 11,000 years ago and Abraham 4,000 years ago, and if the lifespans recorded in the text are proportional to the passage of time, then that would mean that Noah was living about 40,000 years ago and Adam and Eve somewhere between 50 and 80,000 years ago, which is consistent with the mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome dates. It's also consistent with what we call the anthropological Big Bangs. When we see the sudden explosion of clothing use, art and music, and complex language, and worship practices, all that is consistent with a 50,000 year date for the origin of the human species. Now, what you're seeing here is I agree with my young earth creationist friends that Adam and Eve are recent, and all of us are descended from Adam and Eve. Where I part company is saying that the universe and the earth are billions of years old, not thousands of years old, because as I go through the creation accounts in the Bible, it clearly supports long periods of time, not 24 hours. And you can still get this. There's a debate I had with Answers in Genesis just a few days ago, just before I got on a plane to come here. And what you hear in that debate, and it's posted on our website, there's a link there to the actual radio debate, is that Jason Lyle of Answers in Genesis insisted that the only creation account in the Bible was Genesis 1, where I was claiming there were at least 24 creation accounts in the Bible, but he was discounting Psalms and Proverbs and Job and Isaiah as not being accounts of creation. So that's where we really differ. I would argue there are many creation accounts in the Bible, and that we need to integrate them all. But even based on Genesis 1, it's clear to me that these days have to be long periods of time because the seventh day is not finished. We're still in day 7. Over here.
Hi, have you had the opportunity to look further into the discoveries of Dr. Mary Schweitzer finding soft tissue inside dinosaur bones, and do you think it might lead to a possible redating the age of the dinosaurs?
Okay, let me see if I heard that question right. That the discovery of soft tissue in dinosaur fossils, would that cause us to reevaluate the date that scientists give for when the dinosaurs existed. Well, the date that you'll see in the textbooks are that the three generations of dinosaurs, Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous, covered between 250 million years ago and 65 million years ago. And you can get soft tissue from bones that have been buried that long. What will preserve the soft tissue is to keep that soft tissue away from bacteria and away from oxygen. And so the soft tissue that they found with these dinosaurs was encased inside fossilized bone and buried quickly, and what that does is it immediately gets rid of the oxygen and the bacteria, and therefore you can have soft tissue preserved not only for tens of millions of years, but even hundreds of millions of years. And so the only challenge would be if you had found soft tissue that had been exposed to oxygen and to bacteria. But in this case, that's not what's going on. It was well preserved and protected from both oxygen and bacteria throughout that time. And it's not the only example. We see a lot of that soft tissue in non-dinosaur species that are much older than the dinosaurs.
Is this on? Oh, sorry. I've had a pastor explain to me what the 6 days of creation could entail is the fact when you read Genesis, there's an abbreviation of creation starting at Genesis 2 verse 4. It seems to repeat itself. And a pastor explained it to me that he said that the 6 days, or the 7 days actually, were instituted by Moses, who commanded Israel to rest on the seventh day. And that was a radical change in their culture, of course, because they were slaves. So now that was the sort of the idea. For in 6 days God worked, now you rest the seventh. So they were using God as an example for working 6 and resting 1. They were also told to do the same, and that's why you have sort of a repetition through
Right.
Genesis. And but my question is, for creation, when God created Adam, he created him as an adult, fully functioning, ready to work, and he was told to produce children. So he was obviously created as an adult. So here's a guy who's 20 years old, born yesterday. And I'm kind of curious if you think maybe perhaps the creation was created the same way. It looks old, it should be old, but you don't know where God actually started this. It has to start somewhere, and it's hidden from us, and we can calculate. And
Right.
I admire the guys like you. I was very weak in math. I like math anyway. But I appreciate your educated people that can solve these things for us and help us at least have some equipment for this evolution thing that seems to be bombarding our education.
Well, what you're bringing up are two favorite arguments from young Earth creationists as for why the universe is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. And, let me see if I can remember your first point. It had to do with, can you repeat your first point again? I forgot it. Oh, yeah, Exodus 20. Okay, I got it. Their argument is that in Exodus 20, where it talks about the 10 Commandments, it says, as God worked 6 days and rested on the seventh day, you also are to work 6 days and rest on the seventh day. And young Earth creationists claim that that proves that the creation days have to be only 24 hours long. Well, what they overlook is that reference to the 10 Commandments shows that 5 times in the Levitical law. It's not just Exodus 20. And if you look up all 5, you'll see that the comparison is only given twice, and moreover, the preposition is missing in the original Hebrew, so it's not what they claim. Moreover, they overlook Leviticus 25, which speaks about a different work week for the agricultural land. And it says the agricultural land likewise is to obey a Sabbath. And the agricultural land is to be worked for 6 one-year periods and rested on the 7th year. Now, the point here is that God designed the agricultural land with biological limitations. He designed us human beings with biological limitations. And because of our biological limitations, it's important that we get a rest day every 7 days. And some of you may be students of the French Revolution. The French tried to set it up so we had 9 days of work and 1 day of rest. and they quickly discovered that there was a drop in the efficiency of the workers when they went to that program. We've also discovered in the West, where we have people work 5 days and rest for 2 days, that also leads to a drop in efficiency. So by direct experiment, we know that we are biologically designed in a way that we need to be given a day of rest every 6 days. The agricultural land is biologically very different than we human beings, and therefore it has a different prescription. But God is spirit. God has no biological limitations whatsoever. And so what his work period could be is immaterial based on our work period or the agricultural lands period. It could be completely different. And we also see this in other celebrations. For example, you have the Festival of the Tabernacles, which celebrates the 38 years that the Jews wandered in the wilderness. Notice that it's not 38 years, it's just 8 days. 8 days represents 38 years. So the mistake that I think young earth creationists make here is they're taking an analogy and interpreting it as an exact equation. And that's not supported by the way Scripture treats these things in other passages. Now, with respect to Adam being 6 feet tall when God created him, that's not an example for appearance of age. It's simply addressing what does God create first, the chicken or the egg. You would only presume that Adam, and Eve for that matter, were old if you were told that they came from the womb of a woman. But neither one of them came from a womb of a woman. Therefore, their height would not be an indicator of age. And I've argued in my book, A Matter of Days, that if we had scientists present at the moment that God created Adam, he would have measured brand new. No scar tissue, no chipped teeth, no gray hair, no lost hair, and he'd have no liver spots on his skin. I mean, if you were to bring a 10-year-old boy up here, I could actually point out liver spots on his skin. We get that quite quickly. With Adam, no liver spots. Now, of course, we don't have the scientific evidence, but we do have this. We have the declaration many places in the Old and New Testament that it's impossible for God to lie or deceive. He's not going to create things with the appearance of age. He's going to create things actually the way they are. And so Adam and Eve are not examples of appearance of age. They would only be that if indeed they'd come from the womb of a woman, but the text makes it clear that's not how God made them. So we got the microphone somewhere else now.
Hi. You talked about the fine-tuning of several physical constants at the point of creation, or the Big Bang rather. How do you know that these constants could be any value as opposed to exactly the values they turned out to be? For example, I've always thought of the speed of light as being a fixed constant. What is the premise for saying that it could be a variety of values?
Well, the velocity of light is one of those constants that must remain fixed. Change it ever so slightly at any time in the history of the universe, and no life is possible. It's fairly easy to see through the equation E equals mc squared. Another critique I have young earth creationists, they claim that the velocity of light was 1,000,000 times faster for Adam and Eve than it was for us, because the velocity of light is one of the tools we use to measure the age of the universe. But if you had the velocity of light 1,000,000 times faster for Adam and Eve than it is for us, that would make the heat coming out of the sun 1,000,000,000 times hotter. And the biblical text tells us that planet Earth was not incinerated when God created Adam and Eve, and therefore the velocity of light did not change. But there's many places in the Bible, I quoted one, where it explicitly states that the laws don't change. In fact, that's one of the ways that we at Reasons to Believe have been trying to persuade scientists that the Bible indeed is the Word of God and is error-free, because we now have the capacity to measure the laws of physics at different points in the past. And we've been able to do that as far back as 13 billion years. And so when we look at quasars that are 13 billion light years away, we can measure the gravitational force constant, the velocity of light, the fine structure constant, the ratio of the proton to electron mass, and they're the same as what we measure in the lab today. And so, since the Bible is unique in making this claim about constant physics in the different holy books of the religions of the world, that's one piece of evidence that we have that this is not inspired by human beings, but by someone who actually designed and built the universe. Now, I'm not sure I got to all of your question. If I missed something, please give me a little bit more.
Hello? Hi. But you said, you referred to fine-tuning in the physical constants. So if the physical constants could be only one value, what is the argument for fine-tuning?
Okay, we know it can only be one value plus or minus a tiny amount. If you change it by more than that tiny amount, then life is not possible. Now, what you can get, by the way, the debate I had with Victor Stenger at Caltech in front of the Skeptics Society, you can get that off of our website. The Skeptics Society sells it for $25. We sell it for just $7. And we give it to you uncut. You can see the whole thing. But that was the center of our debate, because he said, Dr. Ross, I disagree with you because I think we can set up a different set of constants of physics and still have the existence of life. And I agreed with him. I said, God has more than one realm. He built a separate realm for the angels. And I would argue from the Bible that the laws of physics for the angels are very different than the laws of physics for us. So God's got more than one option. The anthropic principle, in my opinion, has been misstated as allowing only one possible set of the laws of physics to make life possible. Now, what I would argue is there's one set for life as we know it, physical life that's carbon-based. But it does not mean that God could create a different set of life, not carbon-based, not restrained to length, width, height, and time, and the laws of physics that would have a very different dimensional realm and very different physics. For that matter, that's the promise that God gives us in the new creation, that we're going to enter a realm with radically different physics. So my response to Victor Stenger is God has more than one option, and he can do it a variety of ways. But whatever he does, there's fine-tuning. The realm for the angels is just as fine-tuned as our realm. I'm saying that. I can't prove that, but I'm saying there's got to be fine-tuning there, just as there is for our life.
Hello. Hi there. You mentioned carbon dating, and I've read a book quite a while ago, my memory fails me, on bacterial dating. A archaeologist, I believe, was doing some work in the Mayan ruins, and also was invited to take his theories in bacterial dating with the Shroud of Turin. I found it quite intriguing, the new theory, and I don't know how new it would be, but it was his theory that he developed. Again, my memory fails me who the doctor was. I believe he was a US-based archaeologist and did some carbon dating, or not carbon dating, but this bacterial dating on the Shroud of Turin, and found it, quite accurate to, the claim of Jesus' burial cloth. What is your knowledge on the Shroud of Turin and this doctor or archaeologist who has this bacterial dating, and how accurate it is in comparison to carbon dating?
Well, I've written on the Shroud of Turin. You'll find articles on our website about that, and it's in our magazine as well. Namely that the carbon dating done by JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, has been questioned. And the Roman Catholic Church gave the Jet Propulsion Laboratory scientists just 4 square inches. And based on those 4 square inches, their carbon-14 date for the shroud was 13th century AD. But the error bar was large. And of course it's large because carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,715 years. And with any radiometric dating method, you only get accurate results when you're a factor of 6 away from the half-life or less. So for example, when we're trying to date the Earth, we use uranium dating because the half-life for uranium is 4.5 billion years, which is very close to the age of the Earth, so you get a really accurate date. But you can't use uranium dating to date a Bible manuscript. It's way outside the range. So with a carbon-14 dating, you're going to get good results that are within, say, 1,000 years of the present to about 30,000 years of the present. But 13th century AD is outside that range. And so the Jet Propulsion Laboratory people got a rather large error bar. But they also pointed out that they found dyes in the Shroud of Turin that dated to the 13th century. They also pointed out that the 13th century AD is the same century where Roman Catholics sold 16 tons of lumber from the cross of Jesus. So it was a period of time when artifacts related to Jesus had a very high commercial value. And therefore they concluded that the Shroud of Turin was a very good 13th century forgery. In fact, they said it might be so good that it's possible that they crucified someone to death in order to get it as accurate as they did. Now, the complaint is the carbon-14 date wasn't that accurate, but the Jet Propulsion Laboratory team pointed out if the shroud indeed had dated to the 1st century AD, they would have gotten a very accurate date. The fact that they didn't get an accurate date told them it was much later than the 1st century AD, and they went back to the Roman Catholic Church and said, if you want a really accurate date for the 13th century, give us a square foot. Because the more material you have, the more accurate date you can get. But they were presuming that 4 square inches was plenty enough if indeed the shroud dated back to the 1st century AD. Now, when they said that it was a very clever forgery, they did note that there were pollen grains in the shroud that are indigenous only to the region of Palestine. So they said they went to the trouble of actually using linen cloth from that region, and they also did everything they could to make the shroud look a lot older than it was. And in fact, they may have even taken old material and blended into it. So they weren't claiming that the entire material of the shroud was 13th century AD. They were just saying the cloth itself dated back to the 13th century. Now the controversy still rages, but it's easily settled by just taking a bigger piece of the shroud. But as it is, I think the JPL team is right in saying we have definitively ruled out the 1st century AD as a possible date for the shroud.
Question?
Right here, okay.
No? Oh yeah, okay. My 2 cents worth on the Shroud of Turin, I always just go back to the Bible and figure, you know, that it says in there that he was wrapped like bandages, not covered with a shroud. Anyway, just out of curiosity, so does the scientific community believe then that human history is provable and datable by 40 to 50,000 years, that that's how long human beings have been on the earth? And is that basically and predominantly or only by the monochromatic or whatever
right.
mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome DNA?
Yeah, there is a scientific consensus that the Y chromosome date for the, quote, first man, which I would claim is Noah, not Adam, is 42 to 56,000 years ago. With respect to mitochondrial DNA, the error bars are quite a bit bigger. And in fact, what you'll see in the scientific literature is dates that are around 150,000 years ago, plus or minus 50,000 years. But as I pointed out in my talk, that date presumes no heteroplasmy or triplasmy. And we know that exists in the human population. And it has always existed in the human population. So the date that you get from mitochondrial DNA is 50,000 years ago, but the error bar is probably plus or minus 12 to 15,000 years. So yeah, if you really want a good date, the most accurate date comes from the Y chromosome, not the mitochondrial DNA. But we also get some very good dates from the cultural Big Bangs, from the first evidence of advanced tools, clothing, art, and music. Those are all coming in at about 40,000 years ago. And that 40,000 year date would be consistent with 50 or 60 because you'd expect some passage of time to be required before you would have discoverable archaeological finds to support the Big Bang. And so the 40,000 year date is viewed as being consistent with the 50,000 year date. But if you want to see this laid out over 6 chapters, get our book, Who is Adam? There's 6 chapters worth that talk about the latest dating for human origins.
The Bible says that people live many years, for hundreds of years, 800, 900 years. Can you explain that?
Could I explain the long lifespans that we see recorded in the early chapters of Genesis? Is that the question?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, we deal with this in our book, The Genesis Question, where we point out that when humans were living to be 800 and 900 years of age, they were living in a sedimentary plain. And it was before the Neolithic Revolution, so there wasn't the trading that would bring them into the exposure to igneous rocks. And so if you're not being exposed to igneous rocks, you would be protected from the radiometric decay of uranium and thorium that would exist in those rocks. Today those rocks are traded everywhere, so everybody gets exposed to that stuff. The other thing that's critical is you would need to protect those early humans from cosmic rays. But as I explain in that book, 2 astronomers, Wolfendale from Britain and Ehrlichen from Russia, have been working for the past 30 years on what they call fast-moving heavy nuclei cosmic rays. These are cosmic rays that are from oxygen nuclei on up to uranium. And what they've discovered is all that fast-moving heavy nuclei cosmic ray radiation comes from a single supernova eruption that we're still embedded in. The supernova remnant is 40 degrees across the sky. And given the size of the remnant and the intensity of that radiation, that means that supernova must have exploded a few tens of thousands of years ago. Well, that would mean you could have in a scenario where you got humans living before the supernova eruption and humans living after the supernova eruption. And it's the heavy, fast-moving nuclei cosmic rays that really do the damage and bring about early cancer deaths. And so before the supernova eruption, and if you got people living in a sedimentary plain only, people could potentially live much longer. But as my co-author Fazrana points out, you also need to adjust the telomerase activity on the chromosomes. Our chromosomes are designed to shorten fairly rapidly as we get older and older, and that actually helps preserve our life. Because of the shortening of the chromosomes as we get older and older, that protects us from dying even at a younger age from cancers. So it's an excellent protection from early cancer death. Basically stops runaway cancers from running to the degree that they otherwise would. And so we argue that it's a combination of all three. God setting in place a different telomerase activity level for the early humans, lack of exposure to fast-moving heavy nuclei cosmic rays, and protection from igneous rocks. But I also point out in the Genesis question that the average lifespan today is longer than the average lifespan in the days before Noah. It is true you get a few individuals living to be 800 and 900 years. However, the vast majority of the population at that time did not die of natural causes. They were dying as a result of murder. In fact, you'll see a calculation in the book where we demonstrate that a minimum of 19 out of 20 people were dying as a result of murder in the days before the flood, and therefore their average lifespan was actually less than what it is today.
Hi. Appreciate being patient with all of us and stuff. And I know that a lot of the answers to a lot of these things are based on a whole bunch of things that it's really hard to share this stuff with lay people and stuff like that because it requires a certain amount of knowledge and stuff. So I was just curious about a minor thing. I always want to know more about, like, how do we know that and stuff, or how do we think we know that? I was just wondering about the number of, you quoted something about the number of estimated or known neutron particles or something like that, or subatomic particles or something like that in the universe. How the heck did we know that?
Okay, how do we know that the number of protons in the universe must be equal to the number of electrons to better than 1 part in 10 to the 37th? We know that because it's crucial for advanced life to exist that the universe be electrically neutral. If you had more protons than neutrons by anything beyond a difference of 1 part in 10 to the 37th, you would now have a serious electrical imbalance in the universe, which would make impossible the existence of spiral galaxies. So the very fact that we live in a spiral galaxy with symmetrical arms tells us there must be this balance. That's also required in order to have stable burning stars existing all over the universe. So no, we didn't go out and count all the protons and neutrons and electrons. No one's been able to do that. But we say, you know, if the balance was a little bit less than what it is, what kind of physical consequences would that have for the physics of galaxies and stars? Anyway, I document all that in my book, The Creator and the Cosmos, and you'll see citations there to the literature where this is all laid out.
I've got a real good question for you. I just happen to know a more intelligent scientist than you, and that's my sister. And her husband. But the question I have for you and those that are able to research and study these things, how do you not engage with someone when they're talking about things in maybe the seventh day, or they're talking about all the research in the seventh day, and you're going back into the first 6 days? How do you stop engaging and say, I realize you don't know what you're talking about, or something? How do you stop that? How do you self-control or something? How do you do that?
Okay. I think I got the question, which is when someone is proposing theological or scientific nonsense, how do you put a stop to that? And in a gracious way. And I think the most gracious way to do it is just to ask questions. You say, how do you understand the text from that perspective? And have you compared, say, Genesis 1 with Genesis 2? Have you ever noticed, for example, how you have both the human male and the human female in Genesis 1 made on day 6? How do you square that with all the events that take place between the creation of Adam and the creation of Eve? That's much more effective than saying, you're dead wrong on the text here. That usually stops people from listening. So just simply ask some questions. How do you wrestle this? How do you make this work? And how do you make this consistent across the scientific disciplines? The thing I run into with biologists, for example, is this presumption that the solar system is constant. And I say, have you actually checked into what happens to the sun as it continues to convert hydrogen into helium in its core? And have you taken that into account in your biological models? And then you'll just kind of get them thinking and asking questions and beginning to question their own particular model. And what's really going on there is that most scientists are hyper-specialized. In fact, when I was doing research at Caltech, all of us astronomers would go to this place called the Burger Continental. And there'd be a table for the X-ray astronomers, a table for the infrared astronomers, a table for the ultraviolet astronomers, radio astronomists. And I can tell you this, if you sat at the wrong table, you couldn't follow the conversation. We were all astronomers, but you better sit with your own specialty or you're going to be in real trouble. And that's the problem with science today. It's hyper-specialized. And so people who have an evolutionary paradigm aren't aware of all the problems in other disciplines and haven't bothered really to integrate. And so one of the things we do at Reasons to Believe is help them make that integration. But we do the same thing at the seminary level. As I speak at seminaries, what I find there again are hyper-specialists, people who know the book of Hebrews very well, but really don't know much else about the Bible. And so we try to help them integrate the 66 books of the Bible. And then what I like to do is get scientists and theologians in the same room and say, God gave us 2 books, the book of nature and the book of Scripture. That's stated in the Belgic Confession. And therefore, it's not an option to only be a theologian or to only be a scientist. If we're a follower of Jesus Christ, we have to be both. And then try to get the scientists and theologians to dialogue with one another. But I did that once, and what I saw was all the scientists on one side of the table, all the theologians on the other side of the table, and it took 30 minutes before they were even willing to speak to one another. So There are challenges out there, but I would argue the best way to deal with those challenges is not to preach, but to ask good questions. Thank you.
Hey, let's give him